on deepening. Oh, yes, we're going to record the session today. That's a reminder that we're going to be doing that. So obviously we will have some people who haven't been able to make it this morning. We're keen to share this expert session with them. So thank you very much for letting us record the session, and welcome again. So my name is Emma Bell. I'm the Executive Director of Innovations for Learning. I'm delighted that so many of you have been able to join us this morning to dive deeply into phonics. I'm particularly pleased to be joined today by Emma Spiers, who will give us a wave. Emma is a phonics expert who's going to be leading today's session. I'll introduce her in a second. Before I do so, I also want to introduce my colleague Becky, who's got a familiar blue background, giving you a wave there, Becky. Becky's going to just help facilitate the session today and field the questions from the chat as we go through the content. So without further ado, I'm going to just give you a little bit of background on Emma and explain the structure of the session. A moment of housekeeping before we begin. Do please keep yourselves on mute. We will be, because there are so many of us, fielding questions via the chat at various points during the presentation. And towards the end of the presentation, we'll do a little poll, which is a new thing for us, but we're keen to get your feedback. And we are going to be going up until about 20 to 10, so 9:40. We recognise that some people need to leave at 9:30. Of course, that's fine. Please do so if you need to. And as I mentioned, the session will be recorded. So the structure of how we're going to do things this morning is that Emma's going to take us through some information and some content about phonics and give you an opportunity to ask some questions. And then I'm going to finish up the session by relating what Emma's just told us to our actual platform, the Tutormate platform itself. So apply the theory to the practice, as it were. So we'll do that after we've heard from Emma. And Emma, as I mentioned, Emma Spiers, it's not particularly helpful for you all that we're both called Emma, which I promise is a coincidence. So we are going to be fielding questions to an Emma Bell, which is me, or an Emma Spiers, which is the other Emma. And Emma is going to has a background as a phonics expert. She's over 20 years experience as a teacher, a school leader, and even Ofsted early years inspector. For the last 10 years, she's run a successful consultancy training teachers and school leaders in the pedagogy of phonics and early reading. And so we're delighted to have someone of her experience and expertise talking to you today. She's also been really helpful to us at Innovations for Learning over the last few months. Those of you who are returning volunteers might have noticed that we've done quite a big revamp and edit of our stories recently, and we've done that so that they align with phonics practice and recommendations from the Department of Education, and Emma's been helping us do that recently. So I'm going to hand over to Emma so she can dive into phonics and very much look forward to hearing your questions after she's spoken.
Oh, hello everybody. Thank you so much for giving us your time. I'm going to whiz through phonics. It's a really hot topic in schools at the moment. So all of the young people that you're working with, their teachers are also going through a process of revamping their subject knowledge in phonics. The Department for Education and Ofsted have got a really critical eye on looking at how well schools teach phonics at the moment and how well particularly struggling readers are coping with phonics as a main way into reading. In this session, like I said, it's a huge topic. Teachers are working on it all year this year, and we're going to do it in just half an hour. I guess really what we want to do is kind of just give you a bit of an overall view. You don't need to know that much to be successful in working in the way that you're working. You know, just a little bit of information can give you all the tools that you need. Also, there's a lot of information and misinformation out there on the internet. So if you're interested in more information when we get to the end, we can let you know some details of places where you can go where it's kind of reliable sources of information. Just to say, if you do things like you look at phonics on things like Pinterest or more widely, if things, or YouTube, often things are posted in America or even Scotland. Actually, they follow an analytic phonics approach, which is slightly different to the ones that we use in the UK. So really, you know, this is about helping you to know where to go to get the information. But everything that you need really is going to be included in this. We're going to learn in a really short space of time what the expectations for phonics and early reading are for year 1 and year 2 children, because they're the children that you work with. We're going to understand a little bit more about how phonics helps word reading. We're going to think about that perfect pronunciation, because I know that, you know, when we're on our journey with phonics, most of us didn't learn phonics when we were at school in the way that children are learning it now. And one of the big things, well, there's two big things: the way that we say those letter sound correspondences, because we say them slightly differently to when maybe some of us were in school, or even when I started teaching 20 years ago, it's different. And also the terminology that children will be able to use. That doesn't mean to say that we always have to use it, but they will be familiar with some of this, I am sure. Also, we'll be looking at one of the areas that is fundamental and perhaps isn't so much, it's not so much seen as a big difficulty, but it actually is, the idea of blending words. So once you've got those letter sound correspondences, how you put those together to read whole words and sentences. And then, as Emma said, we're going to look at the learning platform and relate it to all of that. And I guess in these days when it's phonics is so high priority in schools, and children coming home talking about it all of the time, and teachers are so focused at it because often looking for it, it's easy to think that that's the only part of being able to read. But there's so much research over time which talks about that, you know, phonics only really works well if children have got a background in a language rich curriculum. So all of those things that you're familiar with, or you will probably, if you've got your own children, you'll recognize: story time, whether you're at home reading to your children, or whether you know there's story time in school, learning to sing songs, rhymes, all of that stuff that children do from memory. These are all going to contribute to children's good phonic development. We know that the skills that children participate in when they're learning to sing songs are you know, they're learning words from memory, they're learning the tune from memory, they're learning to follow along. That's helping their auditory memory, the memory of things that they hear. So when we come to reading later on, auditory memory is a big part of that. And some of you might have children that you're reading with who really struggle at that dog, you know, they just guess because they're not holding all of those sounds in their head long enough to be able to read whole words. So learning songs and rhymes from memory is a key part of, like, brain training, if you like, to help them to be able to hold sounds in their head. Also things like real life reading, you know, often we think about children who perhaps aren't necessarily reading very much at home. They don't engage with reading books that they take home. You know, if you think about how much you read in a day, we read in all kinds of different ways. We read on the back of packets, we read things like bus stop, we read things like road signs, we read timetables. There's tons of stuff that we read that's real life reading that actually, you know, I don't think I ever read novels now, because I just generally don't really like it. I'm not that motivated to do it. But we need to remember that this real life reading is so important. They'll also be doing things in school like group reading, or sometimes reading in a pair, reading on their own, or reading as a whole class. They might have library time in school, or you might, you know, at home they might go to the library. And they also might play in response to stories. You know, they might be playing with puppets to act out a story, say, of Little Red Riding Hood. That's going to help them in their journey to learn to read. So it's not just about the phonics, although there's a big spotlight on that at the moment. So for your year 1 and year 2 children, all they've got to be able to do are two things. They've got to be able to read the words on the page, and they've got to be able to understand what those words mean. What we're trying to do nowadays is move away from children guessing and wanting them to become fluent readers, because if they're all the time, you know, reading a word and then guessing and making it up, or looking at the pictures and making it up for the pictures, they're not really reading. And in the end, you know, that once we take the pictures away, they're going to find it so much harder. So with the idea of using phonics to help the children to be able to read the words on the page, it's designed to get the children to be able to read those words instantly at a glance, and not actually have to really fight so hard to read the words. There was this document that came out by the Department for Education in the middle of the pandemic that is like a guidance for teachers, really, and trainee teachers and schools. And it talks in there about children being able to gain fluency, because when they gain fluency, their motivation increases. They start to enjoy reading more and are willing to do more of it. Fluency just allows us to understand what we read. If we read fluently, then we've got more brain capacity to actually understand the words. And it's about being accurate, saying the sounds accurately, but also reading them quickly without having to sound every single thing out. I just wanted to show you that really phonics is basically cracking a code. That's what it is. So if you're a child who doesn't have any letter sound correspondences, if you haven't learned phonics at all, maybe you're new to school in year 2 and you've never done phonics before, or maybe you are at the very beginning of reception, you're at the beginning of your reading journey, this is what learning to read a sentence feels like. There's a whole load of code on the page and you can't access any of it. So this is where children learn to guess from, because the squiggles on the page, they might be able to recognize a few that might be in their name, but it's really, really tricky otherwise. So this is why we've been working hard together to make sure that the books that you're reading with the children have got a high correlation between the letter sound correspondences, or the codes that they're learning in school, with the books that we're asking them to be able to read. Because if we ask them to read too much that hasn't got the code, then it's going to be really hard, it's going to be really overwhelming for them. So here, for example, I've just introduced one piece of the code. I've just introduced an O, and straight away you can be, you might look at this first word here and it's got 2 letters in it ending in O. So you as a reader might be thinking, that could be go, it could be to, it could be do, it could be so, it could be any of those things. And obviously, because you're a reader, you can work that out. If you're a child, you're not going to be coming to that in any way. You also might know that this postbox sign here, that might be punctuation, it might be full stop. So you're already coming at this from the understanding that it needs to make sense. If you're a child, then you're not necessarily going to be doing that. So just knowing a small amount of letter sound correspondences also isn't enough to be able to decode, to be able to read properly. If I just add in the vowels, it makes it a little bit easier, and you could maybe be starting to look at this with a bit more of a critical eye. But again, you wouldn't be reading with fluency, would you? Because there's too much of the code that's missing. You're having to think, I think this might be ow, maybe it's hour or out. And if that's out, that might be outside. So it still feels a bit too much like a puzzle, doesn't it? You might look at a 3-letter word in the middle of a sentence and think, well, that's probably and if that's a D, then that would be a D. So it feels a bit like a problem-solving situation. Again, we don't want children to be going through that much of a kind of a struggle to be able to read. We want them to be able to read the words automatically, that whole idea of fluency. Again, if I just add in 2 of the most common consonants, a T and an S, even though I've replaced and put a full stop in there, even though I've replaced those, that is still way too hard. There's still too much of the code that the children don't know to be able to read fluently. So if you hadn't guessed, go outside and put the bin out. Great sentence, but it's that whole idea of when we're asking our children to be able to read, we need them to be able to read every single letter sound correspondence that's on that page. Otherwise, they do default to guessing, and that's not an accurate, they're not reading when they're looking at a picture and making a guess. Sometimes it's appropriate if they've made a mistake with the sounding out process to say, oh, just look at that picture. You just said dog, but look on there. Can you see a dog on there? Is there another animal on there? Oh, it's a cat. Let's go back to that word. Let's see if it says cat. And you can go back that way, but I would always suggest that it's a really good idea to let them have a go with the letter sound correspondences and use it as more of a checking tool rather than have a look at the picture, what could it be kind of situation, because in the end we're not really setting them up particularly for success. So phonics, really, there's 2 things that you need to know. There's knowledge of the alphabetic code, that is knowing what that code is to be able to correlate the letters and the sounds, which is probably the bit that we all know. Then there's skills of blending and segmenting. Blending is for reading, which is what we're going to talk about today. And that's where you take all the sounds in a word, k, at, and squish them together, cat, cat, to be able to read a whole word. Segmenting is for spelling, and that's like the opposite of blending. So if I say the whole word cat, I should be able to break it down to be able to spell it, cat. We're not going to talk very much about spelling today or segmenting, because obviously this is a reading programme, but it's important for you to know that the two are interchangeable. And for the rest of this session, we're just going to look closely at those two elements. Children aren't reading, they're not reading the words, they're not cracking that code unless they're doing both of those things. So the knowledge of the alphabetic code, there's loads of terminology, and this is the bit or part of what makes it feel really complicated. So there are words here that relate to what we're trying to achieve with children. So first thing is this acronym, and in education everybody loves an acronym. There's this thing called grapheme phoneme correspondences, and all that is a phoneme is the smallest unit of spoken sound. So we would just call it a sound, wouldn't we? We would hear k, a, t. So it's thinking about the smallest units of sound, spoken sound, because that's what phonics is. It's just a way of being able to think about a word as a series of sounds, spoken sounds. Every word that we say is a breakdown of spoken sounds. And phonics is just that way of getting those spoken sounds down on paper in a coherent way. So a phoneme is the smallest unit of sound, and the grapheme is the written representation of that. So really what we're saying is, instead of, we could, if we were being not very technical and trying to be so fancy, we could just say it's a letter sound correspondence. So this is a really good example. There's an F. So that's the grapheme, that's the written representation, an F, and it makes the sound, the phoneme. That's it. So it's a letter sound correspondence. It's unlikely that the children coming to you are going to call them grapheme phoneme correspondences. It's often more a technical term for teachers, but it's just useful for you to know that that's, primarily what we're trying to do. We're trying to get a letter sound correspondence. Also, there's this thing called a digraph. Now, this is where children starts to get more tricky for children, because in the beginning, it's really easy if we're looking at an F and matching it with the sound. But then they have to learn very quickly that sometimes you get combinations of two letters that make one sound. And this is where children would use the terminology digraph. Is where you've got those two letters, one sound. So they have to learn that A doesn't always say A. Sometimes when it's next to an I, it says A, like in train. I on its own doesn't always say I. When it's next to an A like that, it also says A. So they're going from this idea that there is just one letter sound correspondence to two. Usually the most common ones that they learn, they'll be doing this in reception. But given the pandemic and given the nature of some of your readers, this might likely be a stage that some of your readers would be at. So if they're reading the red books, this is likely to be where maybe these children are falling. So for example, a digraph here might be an A and an R, so that's the grapheme. The corresponding sound is R, easy. This is an O and a W. And when I see those together, that's the grapheme, O and W, and the sound is ow. This one's tricky though, because we know as adults that there's also alternative ways of being able to say that. The O and W can also say ow. There's also trigraphs where you've got three letters making one sound, I-G-H in I being the most common one. And here's another one, E-A-R, making the ear sound. So if you are reading the magenta, the pink, the red or the yellow books with children, these are the letter sound correspondences that those children will be working on. These will be the parts of the code that those children will know. Their teachers will have recognised that this is the code and this is what's in those books. So I thought it would be a really good idea for me to really quickly go through these letter sound correspondences. You can join in with me from your end because everybody's on mute. We can really quickly do that. What I would say is, as I go through these, and I can give you websites to go to afterwards if you need to practice some more, but where I find it hard with some of them, so Y, for example, for me is always yeah, it just is in my head, or Q and U is always quer in my head, or W actually is always were. If I think of a word beginning with that sound, so for example, Y, it might be yogurt. So when I think of yogurt, Y is more of a Y sound. When I think about window for W, it's more of a window rather than a were sound. What we're trying to do is with this way of doing phonics that we use in schools now is we're taking that sound off of the sound. It's called a schwa. But if I was to think about M, when I was at school, it was like m for mummy, and actually really what we're doing is we're taking off that sound, so it's like rather than a m. So this is quite important. It's more important actually for spelling, but it is really important that we get this right. And this might be the bit that where you would find it a challenge. So I'm going to really quickly go through these because we're obviously short of time. If there's any of these that you're struggling with, you can put it in the chat and we can go through it again. So a, t, I, d, g, o, k, 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 e, o, r, b, s, j, v, w, x, y, z, qu, ch, sh, ng, a, e, I, o, u, or sometimes o, like in book, r, or ow, oi, ear, and your. Some things that you might want to think about is that some children might have speech and language difficulties. So some of them, like and can be really hard for them to distinguish between. Also, if I'm thinking about this, sometimes accent can play a big part of this. So I might say, because I'm from the Midlands, my background might be Bath, but my nieces who live in Kent would say Bath, but so it's harder for them because they're seeing an A making an R sound. So there are things for you also to think about. Also, when you get to the yellow and blue books, we'll be working on slightly longer words, and the only bit of terminology that you might need to know that they're moving from consonant vowel consonant, so simple 3-letter words, to longer words, so words where you've got a consonant vowel and 2 consonants, or 2 consonants and then a vowel and a consonant. So gasp, step and flask would be really good examples of those. Again, not necessarily something that the children are going to be saying to you, but it's important for you to be able to differentiate from the pink, red and magenta books. They're basic words. Once you get onto yellow and blue books, the only difference really is the longer words. Okay, I'm just going to pause there for a second. Are there any questions in the chat?
Thank you.
Would anybody like to put any questions?
Yeah, thank you, Emma. Yeah, we've had a few come in. One quickly, actually, someone asked early on to me directly was someone's waiting very patiently. Jamie's waiting patiently to be matched with a child up in Scotland, and just wondering what differences are there in phonics in the Scottish system, because you alluded to it in the introduction.
Okay, so they use a system called analytic phonics. You can Google that. That's much more looking at maybe like patterns of sound. So it's where they might look more at kind of association. So cat, bat, fat, rats, those kinds of things. I don't, this process would work in exactly the same way. I feel like get going and see how you're getting on, because this information isn't misinformation. I think really maybe the process it takes longer, but the fundamentals of understanding the code will be the same. They'll still be learning the same code because the code is the code of the English language, so that'll be true. But I think they used a lot more rhyme and analogy. They also use blends more, where you've got 2 letters, B and R and br and gl and str and tr, like that. They learn those as units to learn. So if you wanted to do some research on those, you could look at blends. Consonant blends is where you've got two consonants next to each other in a word. You'd be easily able to find those because this is the same system that they use in America. There's lots of that around. So yeah, I feel like that might be something that could be useful for you to know. In the systematic synthetic phonics that they use in the rest of the UK, it tends to be more here are all the separate sounds, and I'm going to teach you to blend, so you haven't got so much quite to remember. It's slightly different from the teaching side, but I'm not sure that it will make such a difference from you from a reading point of view.
Great, thank you. So we've got a few here as well. Raffaella was asking about how do you ensure you differentiate between the U sound and the O sound, so U and O.
Yeah, and also that can be so some people can say it as this definitely can be to do with accent, because sometimes if you're in the north of England, people might say oh, like in put, more like that kind of way, and if you're in the south, they might say put. It sounds more like an ah sound. So I feel like this is the kind of thing where you maybe need to think about the children that you're working with and how they might say it, because they're going to be saying it, because it's a spoken sound system matched to the way that you talk. It's important for you to think about, well, how do I talk and how do they talk, and is there any likelihood that there might be any of those that might be similar or might be different. Usually in schools, if we look at a U, we would call it more of an sound. Oh might be more of a oh sound, so it's an oh and an oh. What's tricky is that some of these are quite similar. So if you think about and they are really similar, aren't they? If I was to put my hand there, and they look alike and they sound alike. I can definitely point you in the direction of places where you can go and keep hearing the sounds in the way that they'll be introduced in school, though, for sure. So if you want some details, we can forward those on to you, so you can, I'm aware that we've whizzed through it.
Thanks, Emma. Similarly, someone was asking, they missed the difference between the CK and the CK sounds, if you wouldn't mind.
So that's all the same. That's all the same. So
it's all the same.
That would be the same with S and double S or L and double L. It's just because they've got to be used to seeing it in a book. I think that's, to know that when they see it, it still makes the same sound.
Okay. And the S and the F, again, if you wouldn't mind quickly.
Yeah, so that's the same. So an S on its own will make it, so you can see here on this grid, this S here, you can see the S can make this sound. Two S's can also make it sound. But sometimes we're going to come on to this, a C can make a sound, an SE can make a sound. Sometimes you get an ST, so like in castle, or whistle, or an SC, like in scene. So there's lots of, from that initial stage up to the blue band books is quite straightforward. Once you get into the further books, like the orange and the green books, it's going to become more complex. Shall I go through that a little bit now, or are there any more questions?
We've got lots of questions actually, so that it's great to see. Someone is just asking, how do you encourage a child to attempt the phonic sounds if they're not engaged? Is there any tips on that in particular?
Yeah, I would always do it together. I would right, okay, let's do it together. So I feel like sometimes we feel like we want to see what they can do, but actually, how do we learn? We learn mostly by doing things. Learn anything, we learn by doing something together and being really supported. And as so there's a system that I'm going to show you really quickly in a minute. That's the I do, we do, you do methodology. So I think that might answer that.
Yeah, I think I'm a little bit conscious of time, so I think let's move on. There are a couple of questions in there about phonic schemes and things, but Becky, I think we could get back to people about those, and also give, as Emma suggested, some resources and links to videos for people who want to practice those sounds.
Yeah, so just to know then that this is like, the code is complex. You can see that so far I've just talked you through like the top line of each of these letter sound correspondences. Once children get onto those green and orange band books, they are going to be needing to know all different combinations. They're going to know that there's these split digraphs. So that's when you've got two. Some of you might remember these from school as a magic E. It's where you've got two letters making one sound, and then they're split with a letter in the middle. Also alternative spellings for those sounds. So we might have things where, let me just go back a minute. So we might have things like A-R-E making the air sound, or E-I-G-H making an A sound. Also, so as I allude, that's kind of really what the alphabetic code is. It's learning that code matched to the spoken sounds. The other thing that you need to be aware of is this idea of blending. So this is the bit where children find, this is the part that children actually find really hard. So, for example, I hear with my little ear something which sounds like d-og. You would say dog. I hear with my little ear something which sounds like bird. You would say bird. I hear with my little ear something which sounds like bin. I hear with my little ear something which sounds like e. So really what blending is, and where it starts from, is by hearing those spoken sounds and being able to squish them together in your head to formulate a whole word without the letters even being present. As we go through the different books, I've tried to highlight these in the colours related to the kinds of books that you will be reading with your children. So if we're reading pink band books, for example, we might have words like in, or pin, or if we're on magenta books, it might look like this, chin, or if we're on red books, light. So you can see it's taking each of those bits of the code and squishing them together. Once we get onto yellow and blue books, we can start to look at longer words. Remember I said they were the CVCCC words? So hair, clip, hair, clip. So if it's a 2-syllable word, or a word in 2 parts, you might want to sound out each separate part, or blend each separate part and then squish them back together. Here is the blue words. These are a really good example of the split digraphs. We've got 2 letters making one sound and they're split with a letter in the middle. So I've got pie, I, with I-E mostly coming at the end of words. And then time, I-M, where that split digraph there is split there with an M in the middle. Time. So they're the kind of things you'd likely to be able to see in a blue book. And then in the green books, I or child. So this is where they've learnt that I can be making its letter name as well as its letter sound, or I, sky, where the Y is making it, again, it's making an I sound rather than a U sound. So you can see there, that's really useful as in a progression. And as you know, to answer that question from before, a really good way of being able to do this is by following a process. So if you've got children that find these difficult and they're really struggling, try to do it this way. This is what all of the phonics schemes that are out there, they tend to work in this way. So if they're stuck on a word, I'd do it, bird. Then we do it together, bird. Now you read that word again on your own, bird. It's called an I do, we do, you do process. And that's really important for reading words, but also sentences, because it builds confidence. So I got, I got a, but it big, I got a big cat. I got a big cat. What you'll see there, when I was doing it, when it was my turn, after I'd read each word, I went back to the beginning of the sentence. This is because one of the common difficulties children have is that they struggle to be able to hold it in their head for long enough. They really struggle with that bit. Once they've got to the end of the sentence, they've worked so hard at sounding out each of the separate words that they've forgotten what the beginning of the sentence was. And remember, our aim is not just for them to be able to say those sounds, but actually to be able to understand what they're reading. So that would be, I would do it, I do it, we can, and go back to the beginning of the sentence after each word has been read. Then we would do it together, and then they would do it on their own. So if you've got children who are struggling to engage, then these are sort of the systems that you could try. Also be aware of these tricky or common exception words, the words that, you know, they've been finely thought through when we've been writing the books. So when your teachers have allocated the books to the children, it's likely that the children that have got the book should be, you know, they've allocated a book that matches those kinds of words that they would need. And again, this would be like maybe a, I don't know, a blue or green word sentence. Will, the, is, these. So there's that split digraph. Green, will these green socks fit me? So you can see in that sentence there, what makes that harder is you've got 3 different ways of making that E sound. Right, I am aware that this is a massive whiz through, and we'd really like to be able to relate this to the content on the platform. Emma, what would you like to do? What do you think would be the best thing to do next?
Thanks, Emma. I think I'm going to just dive in and show people in the last 3 minutes a couple of things on the platform that will help them apply some of the excellent lessons that you've learned. And I'm fascinated to see that lots of comments are coming through in the chat to say how much people have valued what you've said and that they'd like even more. So we'll definitely think about that. So I'm going to share my screen just very quickly to just remind everyone that when you're looking at our platform and you're choosing the reading level, you're going to initially see these little coloured circles. And these are the coloured circles that Emma referred to. And if you're in the story part of the platform, you are going to then select a level to start reading. So I'm going to choose Magenta so that I can demonstrate to you the books that are in the Magenta part of the platform. Hopefully I've just been kicked out of the platform because I had this set up earlier on. So let me make sure that I get into the right place. So I'm going to just choose the Magenta section and just go into one story here. I'm going to choose Liz the Pet. And this is a story that is designed for an early reader who is really just getting to grips with those individual sounds and a couple of sight words. So the sight word, the tricky word that Emma alluded to in this sentence would be the, for example. So do remember that you are able to click on the words at your end, which will highlight the whole word for the children that you're talking to. So they'll know which word you're expecting them to have a go at sounding out. We can't, unfortunately, highlight individual phonemes or sounds in the words at the moment, but you can highlight an individual word. What you can also do if you want to sound out a particular word and work with the child on the actual separate letters in the word is that you can, I'm just showing you the little screen there, which gives you an indication of what the child should be seeing, hopefully, is you can type the individual phonemes with a nice space between them into your message pupil box. And you could do that one by one. And you can see that the little owl that you're familiar with has got those individual phonemes separated out. So you could say, right, let's focus on the first letter in that word, which is the L. And then the child, as Emma said, you can do I do, we do, you do, to work through individual sounds. So the platform can help you do that.
I'd say a key thing to just watch out for there is that obviously in the title we've got capital letters, and we obviously can translate easily, can't we, between lowercase and uppercase letters. So just be aware that that might be a difficulty, that they might find it hard. They might not be able to recognize, they might be able to recognize an L as a lowercase but not as an uppercase. That might be some kind of misconception that children at the early stages might have.
Yeah, that's a really great point, Emma. And you know, all of our proper names are going to be capitalized in our stories, as they should be. So approaching names, particularly with that in mind, will be really important. So just, you know, an example of a page from this particular story. You know, you can see that these are very simple words that you can do exactly the techniques that Emma's talked about to get through the sentence, kind of work through the word by word, modeling going back to the beginning of the sentence each time so that you can build it And these texts have been very specifically designed so that the children who are reading them should feel secure in these sounds, and what they're working on with you is the fluency and the enjoyment, and the ability to kind of bring some kind of expression to the story. So I think I will leave it there, because I'm conscious we are at 9:40, and we probably will have lost some people along the way. And I want to be respectful of your time, but thank you very, very much for joining us. Are there any kind of final questions, Becky, that have come through in the chat that those people who are able to stay for a couple of minutes would like to have answered?
Yes, perhaps these last two ones. That Angela is asking, do we mention punctuation, such as a question mark, to the children when they are present in the story that they're reading?
The way that I would go about that is let them read the sentence, because really the idea of punctuation is about expression, isn't it? You know, like if you read something with a full stop, it's going to read differently to if you read it with a question mark. The way that we express that as readers is going to be different. That's the whole point of it. So I would let them read the whole sentence and then read it back and point the question mark to them and say, oh, this looks like it's a question, so let's read it. I'll read it like it's a question, now you read it like it's a question. So I think it's remembering that your job as somebody who's supporting an early reader is okay to do it a bit at a time, and it's okay to do it together. It's not a test. You're not seeing what they can do and not adding any value. You're helping them to be better readers. So they might be able to actually say the letter sound correspondences and read the words and read the sentence, but what you're trying to do is also get them to read for meaning. So that's really the point of the punctuation. That's also a really good question.
And I think the other thing, just to build on what Emma said, is that your role is so much about encouragement and praise. You know, we have the little owl, we have the stickers. You know, they're not going to get it right. The reason they're using this program is because they need your help to become fluent and confident, and they're probably, you know, living in situations where there's not much support necessarily at home. So have fun with it, you know, encourage them, make jokes, you know, make mistakes, you know, let them correct you. There's all kinds of ways that you can inject a little bit of lightness into the session, because it can, you know, it can feel like a little bit of an uphill struggle when you're
confidence is a big part of learning to read. It's harder than the actual phonics, you know. With anything, if you've got a poor mindset or you already feel like you can't do something, then it's always going to be 100% harder than it was in the first place. So I think if we bear that in mind, it's sometimes hard for us to see that, because sometimes as readers, we don't see how hard it is for them. But learning this whole code, when you see it spread out on those slides, it's a lot, isn't it? And you think they're year ones and year twos, they've barely been in the world any amount of time. So, yeah.
Becky, well, we still have some people with us, keen to make sure that final things can be answered for anyone who's not.
Well, there's come up a couple of times as, how do I do words like through and bought?
Whoa, that's so yeah, so that's that where you've got OUGH making the, so it's knowing what, yeah, so it's knowing that this is what I mean about those alternative pronunciations. So, you know, like on that example where we'd got AI and EIGH, like in sleigh. So this is about knowing, I guess really it's about before you do the book with the child, before you approach it, just going through and just checking that there might be any of those before you start, because you don't want to get to that stage where you're halfway through and you're like, oh, what's that? And it breaks the flow of this. So I might bring that up before we even start the book, and talk about, well, this OUGH can make this sound, but it can also make this sound. In this book, when we see it, it's going to be in this word and it's going to make this sound. So almost like preparing them for the fact that when they get to that bit, so I guess you could use that search box for that again before you start.
And you will notice that on the higher level text, those of you who got to that point, we do often give you information about challenge words. And that is designed deliberately at the beginning of the book to let you know of a word that is likely to be a challenge for a reader who's at this level. And sometimes they're included because they're great words that are helpful for the plot of the story, but we know that children won't have come across those sounds at that reading level. So they're, you know, you give the child that word, you talk about that word before you begin the story. But, you know, again, if you come across a word, you can say things like, oh, this is such an exciting word because it's a different way of saying those sounds, you know, and make it feel like a journey of discovery that they're going on with you, because it will be something that they've not necessarily come across before.
Yeah, and English is such a complex language. As soon as you've learned one rule, it's broken, and then you've got to learn another rule. And yeah, I guess we're always on that kind of a learning journey. And I suppose what makes it hard for us is that we didn't necessarily learn in this way. So we're not replicating something we learned. This is quite new. I guess what I would say, after years and years and years of doing this, that it really, really helps these struggling readers. And I don't think that the teachers should be allocating the books. I think from the way that we talked about it before, Emma, the teachers will be allocating the books based on the codes that the children know. And regardless of what approach they use in school, that the teachers will have given that due consideration, because they shouldn't really be reading a book that's got any element of code that they've not been taught already.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. It's just there'll obviously be some situations where children haven't retained what the teacher thinks they've retained. Yeah, so exactly, they may, that's what you might come across. Excellent. So any final question, Becky, before we draw this excellent session to a close?
I'm just going back up to Anna's question about what phonic companies, do we know what phonics companies the schools we work with use?
A really interesting question, Anna. Yeah. So there'll be a whole variety of them. There are, I think, 30 and counting validated schemes now for synthetic phonics in English UK schools. So that's definitely a question you can pose to your teacher. You know, do send the teacher a message using a platform and say, I'm really keen to make sure I've got this right. And this is not an expectation, so don't feel that, you know, all of you have got to make time to do that. But if you are interested, then by all means ask a teacher, and then, you know, they might even be able to point you in the direction of resources that they've been able to access, you know, that are public resources about that scheme and the way it builds things. You know, most of the schemes, particularly in the very early stages, are very similar, because, you know, it's very unusual for any scheme to teach anything other than sa, a, ta, pa, I, na in that order at the very beginning of reading. They differentiate much more when it gets to the later stages in terms of the sequencing of which sounds they introduce when. But again, as Emma said, the teachers have information about the groups of sounds that are in our coloured books, and they should be choosing a level which, you know, children are secure already at that level to build their confidence.
Also don't overthink it too much. You know, there's a lot of talk about these phonics schemes in schools at the moment, and there's a lot of money changing hands. It's very expensive to be buying in these validated programs, but as the Department for Education reading framework says, and this is true, they all do exactly the same job. They're teaching the children to blend, and they're teaching them the letter sound correspondences which match with the national curriculum. So they might all have different little picture cards. Some of them got picture cards, some of them haven't, some of them got little sayings, some of them haven't, but it's not a determining factor as to whether the children will learn to read. Really, by the time they come to you, they should know the letter sound correspondences that are in the book, because the teachers allocated the book, and you shouldn't need to overdo that. You're just trying to get them to transfer those, give them extra practice at being able to put those words together in sentences in a book situation.
Wonderful. And on that positive note, I think we'll draw things to a close. Thank you all so much for coming today, for your enthusiasm and some great comments in the chat, and for your participation and your fantastic questions. Thank you very much, Emma, for giving us what could be, you know, many hours of teaching sessions.
Whistle-stop tour is what it was.
Squashed down into something. Well, you talked very well, very fast, and I think we've learned that there's an appetite for this, and that maybe the next session we do on this topic will make slightly longer. But, you know, thank you all, and we look forward to, if you are able, to us joining Emma again for 2 sessions in January, one on how to engage shy and reluctant readers, and another one on how to challenge more confident readers. where we'll be, you know, learning from Emma's expertise, and then also taking a look at the platform as we did today to think about the tools and techniques you could use. So have a lovely holiday, those of you whose break is about to come, and we'll see you in the new year.
Happy Christmas,
Thanks very
everybody.
much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.